and from all the sites from where we were getting the copper tools and equipments in abundance, the kind of potteries which were attached and were being used by the people who are and who were living in those sites from where these copper tools were excavated in abundance were found. Examples from where OCP potteries were found in abundance is Jodhpura of Rajasthan, Atranji Kheda of UP, Ganeshwar, Rajasthan, found in close proximity with the Khetri mines of. Why pottery is important and why do we need and why there is a need to study pottery. Paintings, yes, I told you that paintings, they actually act as a bridge in order to understand the cultural diversity of the human civilization, whereas potteries are no less important in order to understand the same thing in which paintings are doing their job. Yes, in order to understand the complete culture of the human civilization, potteries are also very important. And this is the reason why. Historians are calling different kind of potteries. These potteries are given different name, which these names which are given to these potteries by the historians, they are I would say they are indicating that in which culture these type of potteries were found. We know that the making of pottery started in the Neolithic phase. However, there are some evidences which are suggesting that it was towards the end of the Mesolithic phase and the beginning of the Neolithic phase where we find the making of potteries. However, the potteries which are made and which were made in this phase of history, they are mostly handmade potteries. With the time on, as the time progresses, we see that in the history when we were studying about the ancient India, I told you that slowly and gradually the paintings which were mostly handmade and now they have become the potteries which are being made out of the foot wheel. This is how the Neolithic potteries can be studied. However, the Neolithic potteries, they do not show any evidence of paintings on it. They do not show any kind of decoration which was done by the Neolithic pottery makers. However, in order to beautify their potteries, rice husk was generally used in order to beautify the kind of potteries which they were making. For example, when you were making the potteries on the foot wheel, when the mud was still wet, you attach the rice husk to the surface, to the outer surface of the pottery, and in this way, the kind of the pottery which you were getting, means after being dried up, the kind of the pottery which is actually coming before you is the kind of the pottery which is having the rice husk attached to its outer surface, which is looking like that. Why they were doing it? Because the reason behind it, just like the historians were thinking that the use of rice husk on the outer surface of the Neolithic potteries must be done by the Neolithic pottery makers in order to beautify their potteries, because we do not find any evidences of the paintings on the outer surface of the potteries which were made by the Neolithic pottery makers. So this is the Neolithic potteries before you. These potteries are mostly handmade, and these potteries are even not burnished. These potteries are just handmade pottery. After making the pottery, you were leaving the clay to get dry so that you get the desired potteries. However, the mud is not put, means these potteries were not burnt in order to provide these potteries a kind of strongness which is being done as we have and as we will be experiencing in the later ages. After making the potteries, what these guys are doing, they are burning the pottery, because the clay, the mud which is being used to make the pottery, after being burnt, they become much more hard and yes, water resistant, I would say. Means the potteries which are dried by burning them can retain the water for the longer period of time than the potteries which are like this. The potteries which are not burned, the potteries which are most of the times are left to dry under the sunlight. This is what the Neolithic age describes. As we have already seen that, we find the first reference of the pottery in the Neolithic age. Naturally, these kinds of potteries are handmade potteries. But during the later period in the Neolithic age, a foot wheel was also used in order to make the potteries. The most of the important features of Neolithic potteries that these potteries are unglazed and unburnished. Why they are not glazed? Because they are not burnt in order to, I would say, if you will not burn the pottery will not, or the pottery cannot give you a kind of glaziness which is required and which can be seen in the potteries of the later period. Because what we are finding in the later period means the periods which are succeeding the Neolithic age, that after making the potteries, you are burning the pottery. You are burning the pottery in order to, I would say, give much more firmity, in order to, I would say, in this way the potteries were getting much more stronger than the Neolithic age, and they were becoming much more water resistant. Means water resistant will not be the word, will not be the correct word here, but the water holding capacity is much more in the potteries which are burnt than the potteries which are left to dry under the sunlight. And that is why these potteries are left to dry under the sunlight. These potteries are most of the times are handmade potteries. This is the reason why Neolithic age potteries are not glazed, because they are not burnished. Yes, the handmade potteries, one most important thing, if you are making the potteries by hand, very naturally you can see that those kind of potteries will be very much thick. Those kind of potteries will have a coarse grey. Here the grey word is used for I would say the color of these the potteries. And if you look at these potteries very categorically, you will see that thinness of pottery cannot be seen anywhere. Even the edges of these potteries are very much thick. This is the reason why we are saying that these potteries are mostly handmade potteries, and that is why they are very coarse potteries. The potteries which will be handmade, those potteries will be coarse potteries. Means those potteries will be very much thick potteries. They are not refined potteries, because the kind of potteries which the humans are making in the ages to come, they are much more refined, they are much more glazed. Why? Because those potteries are burnished potteries. Those potteries are dried by burning them. That is why they are not having the higher water retaining capacity, but those potteries are also looking great when you see them. The refinement, I would say, the expertise can be seen in the potteries, which are actually produced in the age to follow the Neolithic period. Yes, the potteries of the Neolithic age is devoid of any paintings. However, in order to beautify their paintings, they were attaching the rice husk on the outer surface of the potteries when the potteries were still wet. For example, this jar, if we studied this jar, we saw that the outer surface of the jar is very much, I would say, the outer surface of the jar is very much rough, and when the historians studied these pottery, and especially this jar specifically, they saw that the rice husk were used on the outer surface. That is why the potteries were even more rough than these potteries, which do not have any evidence of rice husk being attached to the outer surface. So yes, they were using the rice husk in order to, I would say, in order to beautify, in order to make their potteries look good. These types of potteries were found throughout India, including the South India also. However, most of the potteries were found from Burzahom, the area in Kashmir. So this is all about the Neolithic potteries. The next kind of pottery which we need to study is called the ochre colored pottery. This ochre colored pottery can be placed between 1500, or I would say can be placed between 2000 BC to 1500 BC. And if you can imagine about this age, I already told you that this is the age which is considered as the high time, as well as it is also famous as the decline of the famous Harappan civilization. Yes, most of the potteries in which most of the potteries which are found from the sites which are inhabited by the people of Harappan civilization were not only using, were making the ochre colored pottery. However, Harappan potteries, particularly the potteries which were made by Harappans, it is much more different than the ochre colored pottery. But ochre color or the OCP potteries are found throughout the period or throughout India between 2000 to 1500 BC, and even the kind of the potteries which the Harappans were making were also having many similarities with the OCP potteries. And that is why this is called ochre colored pottery. Why it is called as OCP? Now we are trying to read that. OCP people are regarded as junior contemporaries of Harappa. Yes, junior contemporaries. Why? Because the potteries which were made by Harappan people is not completely, the pottery made by Harappans is not completely OCP in nature. However, they are having many similarities with the OCP potteries, like the color of Harappan potteries, and the potteries which were made by the OCP people is absolutely same. This pottery is actually identified with the copper hoard culture. See, when you read about this copper hoard culture is that culture of ancient Indian history when we started finding the copper tools from the sites in abundance. We already have studied about the Chalcolithic phase. The Chalcolithic phase and yes, the copper hoard culture is actually attached with the Chalcolithic phase, because it is from this time period onwards when we started finding the copper tools, copper equipments in abundance. And that is why this abundance of copper tools from different sites in India were termed as copper hoard culture. And from all the sites from where we were getting the copper tools and equipments in abundance, the kind of potteries which were attached and were being used by the people who are and who were living in those sites from where these copper tools were excavated in abundance were found to be using, and they were found by the historians that the kind of potteries which were being used by the people who were inhabiting the copper hoard sites were using OCP kind of potteries. However, they are the junior contemporaries of Harappa. Why? Because the Harappan potteries are not completely identical with the OCP. But yes, OCP kind of potteries and Harappan kind of potteries are having some similarities. However, what is the biggest dissimilarity between the Harappan and the OCP? Harappans are trying to beautify their potteries by drawing the designs over their potteries. However, in OCP culture, we do not find any. Yes, the color of the OCP potteries, it is ranging from orange to red. This is the reason why these are called ochre colored pottery. The period of OCP, as I already told you, is between 2000 to 1500 BC, means before the beginning of Vedic age. The kind of potteries which were found from India in large quantity is OCP potteries. So this is what you need to remember. The first kind of pottery is actually related with the Neolithic period. As the Neolithic period ends, we see the beginning of Harappan civilization in India, and Harappan civilization is not only studied for their own potteries, but in spite of using their own type of potteries, they were also found to be using OCP potteries. OCP potteries range from orange to red. This is the reason why they are called OCP. And yes, OCP potteries and Harappan potteries are not completely identical in nature. This is what you need to remember. Major sites from where OCP potteries were found is Jodhpura of Rajasthan, Atranji Kheda of UP, Ganeshwar, which is located near Khetri copper mines, was initially believed to be OCP, but researchers are still confused regarding Ganeshwar. However, according to the recent study, Ganeshwar and the kind of potteries which we found from this site called Ganeshwar, yes, those potteries are now termed as OCP. As the reason of this and because of this research, OCP potteries and the list of the sites which are attached with OCP pottery, now Ganeshwar too can be counted as one of the example of it. So major examples from where OCP potteries were found in abundance is Jodhpura of Rajasthan, Atranji Kheda of UP, Ganeshwar, Rajasthan, found in close proximity with the Khetri mines of Rajasthan. This is what OCP pottery looks like. As we know that from 1500 BC, we saw the beginning of Vedic age in India, that age which continues till 600 BC and can be subdivided into two phases. First phase is called Rigvedic age, and the second phase can be termed as the later Vedic age. The Rigvedic age, which is from 1500 BC to 1000 BC, and the later Vedic age, which is from 1000 BC to 600 BC, both these phases can be attached with a particular kind of pottery which were called PGW. PGW is called painted grey kind of potteries. But before we continue our class, in order to study the PGW culture of Vedic age, I would like to show some images as far as Harappan potteries were concerned. This is the Harappan potteries. These potteries were ranging from orange to red in color, and this is the basic commonality of the potteries of Harappa and OCP. But yes, Harappan potteries are much more beautiful because they were making the designs in black color on the outer surface of the potteries, which is completely absent as far as OCP potteries were concerned. OCP potteries are much more simple. Those potteries were found, that means the major past behind the OCP potteries is that, according to historians, OCP potteries were being used by those peoples who were inhabiting the copper hoard sites. I told you that copper hoard sites were those sites which were found, that means were those sites which yielded very large quantities of copper tools, and that is why, according to historians, they were termed as copper hoard sites. Not all the copper hoard sites were Harappan sites, and I would say 98% of the sites which were copper hoard sites were not Harappan in nature. That is why the people who were inhabiting the copper hoard sites and the kind of pottery which were being used by these people who were living in the copper hoard sites, those potteries were not completely different from the Harappan potteries, but yes, they are different in many aspects. Like these kinds of potteries which were drawn by OCP people, which were made by OCP people, they were not using any kind of designs on the surface of the pottery. However, the color of OCP pottery is ranging from orange to red, which is the basic common feature as far as the potteries of OCP and the potteries which were made by Harappan people is concerned. Yes, Harappans were not only making the geometrical designs in order to beautify their potteries, but they were also making the animal figures on the potteries in black color. This is how the Harappan potteries looked like. Yes, so this kind of pottery was found from Lothal. So this is what the Harappan potteries were, and they were, yes, different from OCP, but they were not completely different. But yes, according to the kind of the designs which were found on the Harappan potteries, in that aspect, Harappan potteries were completely different from OCP potteries, because in OCP potteries we do not find any designs on the outer surface. Though OCP potteries are ranging from orange to red, which is the basic common feature as far as OCP and Harappan potteries are concerned, but yes, OCP potteries were found throughout India between 2000 BC to 1500 BC, although Harappan potteries were just were found within the 4 areas which I told you, from Mandu to Daimabad, Sukta, Gandor till Alamgirpur of UP, the 4 prominent points of Harappan civilization. Though some of the Harappan potteries were found outside the complex in Mesopotamia, which signifies that might be Harappans and Mesopotamians were trading with each other. Although some of the Mesopotamian potteries were also found in India. In this way we get to this point.